Elite professors try to humiliate a black student, have no idea he's a math genius. A storm brewing in the classroom. It was a crisp autumn day, and the prestigious math department of one of the country's top universities buzzed with the energy of bright minds, each student eager to tackle the complexities of advanced calculus. The classroom, with its walls lined with blackboards and shelves full of textbooks, seemed to pulse with the weight of academia. Students shuffled in, finding their places, some eager, others nervously clutching their notes, aware of the rigor the class demanded. At the front of the room stood Dr. Langston, a man whose reputation preceded him, tall, with sharp features and a voice that could command the attention of even the most distracted student. He was the embodiment of mathematical brilliance in the eyes of many. A tenured professor at this elite institution, he had shaped the minds of the brightest, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned his place at the pinnacle of academia. No student had ever dared challenge him, and he was certain no one would ever dare to challenge him today, not in this class. As Dr. Langston began his lecture on the intricacies of advanced integral calculus, the students settled into a hushed silence, their pens flying across notebooks. However, among them sat one student, James Carter, a black man who seemed to fade into the background, despite his remarkable presence. James was used to being underestimated. At first glance, he might seem like just another student, quietly listening, never drawing attention to himself. But beneath that calm demeanor was a mind sharper than most, a mind that had solved problems so complex they would leave even seasoned mathematicians scratching their heads. Yet on this campus, where the finest minds gathered, James had learned to stay quiet, to avoid drawing attention to himself. He had learned to fit in, to play the part of the average student, though his intellect soared above the rest. The professors here, especially Dr. Langston, hadn't taken James seriously. They assumed he was no different from the many others who sat in their lectures with ambition, but no real understanding of the depth of what they were learning. They looked at James, young, black, from a modest background, and wrote him off before he even had a chance to speak. Today was no different. Dr. Langston paced in front of the class, explaining the theory of integration by parts, gesturing animatedly at the blackboard. He had asked the class a question, something difficult, perhaps meant to test their understanding of the theory. Students scribbled notes, but no one seemed eager to answer. Silence lingered for a moment too long. "Come now, someone must have an answer," Dr. Langston said, his voice thick with the usual condescension reserved for students who were too timid to speak up. He looked over the class, his gaze lingering on James. The glance wasn't one of encouragement. No, it was one of dismissal. The kind that said, "You won't be able to solve this, and I won't be surprised if you fail." James met his gaze for a moment, his eyes steady. He could feel the weight of that glance, a glance that spoke volumes without words, a glance that said he wasn't good enough. But James, for all his brilliance, wasn't in the habit of standing up for himself. Instead, he looked down at his notebook, pretending to focus on the scribbles that filled the page. But that would soon change. Dr. Langston, after a brief pause, called on a student sitting near the front of the class. "David, can you give it a try?" The student, eager to impress, stood up, confidently presenting a half-formed answer. Dr. Langston nodded along, giving a slight, approving smile. But as the student fumbled through the solution, it was clear to anyone with a sharp eye that the answer was incomplete, the logic flawed. Dr. Langston didn't correct him. He never did. Instead, he patted David on the back and praised him for trying. The subtle yet deliberate praise made James's blood boil. He had solved far more complex equations in his head without the slightest hesitation, but here he was, invisible in the classroom. The professor's approval was reserved for someone who, quite frankly, didn't deserve it. But this wasn't the first time. This wasn't the first time James had seen students with far less ability than him receive praise just because they fit a certain mold, because they looked the part of a successful student. James knew the moment was coming, the moment when he would be pushed too far. "All right," Dr. Langston said, now turning to the board with a smug smile. "Let's see if anyone in here can solve something that's actually difficult." He scribbled a complex series of equations across the board, equations that made even some of the most capable students sit up straighter in their chairs. A challenge, he thought, that would weed out the weak from the strong. And then, almost in a quiet aside, as if trying to see himself, he added, "Let's see if Mr. Carter over there is up for it." The comment was laced with an edge of sarcasm, almost as if Langston was daring James to make a move, to prove him wrong. "Go ahead," Langston seemed to think. "Let's see how you handle this." The class fell into an awkward silence. James didn't respond. He didn't need to. He had heard it all before. The quiet mockery, the assumptions that were made because of the color of his skin. He'd gotten used to it, or at least he thought he had. But something within him stirred this time, a flicker of rebellion against the subtle demeaning that had become too familiar. He stood up. The room froze. James walked toward the board with the calm of someone who had solved problems far greater than the one presented in front of him. He picked up the chalk, and the class watched in stunned silence as he began solving the equation with ease. It wasn't just a matter of solving it. He made the problem look like something simple, something anyone could do. He didn't explain it aloud. He didn't need to. The board was filled with the elegant strokes of his solutions, the math flowing effortlessly from his mind. In seconds, the room was left in silence, the only sound the chalk scratching against the board. The professors, initially smug in their high expectations of failure, exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Langston's smile faltered, and for the first time in a long while, he felt the sting of doubt. Was it possible? Could this student, whom he had underestimated so completely, actually be the one to solve this challenge? James finished the problem, turned around, and quietly walked back to his seat, his heart beating calmly in his chest. The class was silent, unsure of how to react. There was no applause, no recognition, just stunned faces. But for James, that was all the recognition he needed. The storm had begun. The silence that follows. The air in the classroom was thick with disbelief. Dr. Langston stood frozen, staring at the board where James had just demonstrated the solution to a problem that no one in the class, not even the most capable students, had been able to crack. The chalk dust settled in the quiet room as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. James Carter, the quiet black student who had been written off as someone who didn't belong, had just exposed the arrogance of the so-called elite professors in front of the entire class. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The classroom, usually buzzing with the sound of questions and the scratching of pens against paper, now felt like a mausoleum, a place where the truth had been buried beneath layers of assumptions and prejudice. James, for his part, didn't look at anyone. He had solved the problem, and in doing so, had made his point. His calm, measured approach was in stark contrast to the internal chaos brewing in the minds of the professors, who had once assumed they were the only authorities in the room. He had not only solved the equation, he had exposed them for their blind spots, their biases, and their inability to recognize real talent when it stared them in the face. Dr. Langston, despite the shock, tried to regain control of the situation. He cleared his throat, attempting to mask the discomfort now creeping across his face. The students, unsure of how to process what they had just witnessed, glanced from one another to the professors, waiting for a sign of what to do next. They had been conditioned to believe that the professors were infallible. And yet here they were, upstaged by a student they had assumed would fail. "Well," Dr. Langston began, forcing a chuckle, "it seems we have a problem here. I thought I was testing the class, but I suppose I've underestimated someone." He attempted to steer the conversation into safer waters, his voice laced with an awkward attempt at humor, as though brushing aside the monumental error that had just unfolded. But James wasn't interested in playing the game. He didn't need to. He wasn't there for their validation, their approval, or their fleeting praise. He had been underestimated, belittled, and overlooked for far too long. This moment was not for them. It was for him. For all the moments in his life when his potential had been dismissed because of the color of his skin, his socioeconomic background, or simply because of the way the world had conditioned people to view someone like him. The class, meanwhile, sat in stunned silence. Some students, those who had once been his quiet supporters, now looked at him with newfound respect. Others, still caught in the web of their biases, couldn't quite understand what had happened. James was a student like them, wasn't he? He didn't fit the mold of the academic elite, and yet he had just demonstrated a brilliance they couldn't ignore. Dr. Langston, still recovering from the blow to his pride, moved the lesson forward, attempting to salvage some semblance of control. But the mood in the room had shifted. The energy that once flowed from the professor's authority now felt tenuous, fragile. His attempt to move on with the lecture was interrupted by the weight of the moment, a moment that couldn't be undone. As the class continued, James did what he always did. He listened. He didn't need to prove anything further. The challenge had been issued, and he had responded in the only way he knew how. With clarity, with genius, without hesitation. But as the lecture continued, the professors began to speak among themselves, their whispers barely audible, though their discomfort was evident. They had underestimated James, and now they had to reconcile with their own egos and biases. Dr. Langston, in particular, struggled with the idea that a student like James, a student who didn't fit the usual profile of a brilliant mathematician, had shattered his carefully curated worldview. He had always been the one with the answers, the one in control, and now here he was, faced with a reality he had not prepared for. During the break between classes, James sat quietly in his seat, pulling his notebook closer. The other students, still processing what had happened, didn't know how to approach him. Some avoided his gaze, uncomfortable with the truth they had just witnessed. Others, however, walked past him with a mix of awe and uncertainty. They had seen something rare, the raw brilliance of someone who had been overlooked and underestimated for far too long. One student, a young woman named Rachel, gathered the courage to approach James. She had been one of the ones who had assumed he was just another student, another face in the crowd. But now, seeing him up close, she realized how wrong she had been. "James," she said softly, "that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it." James turned his head toward her, his eyes calm but with a certain depth that many had never bothered to notice before. "It's just math," he said simply. Rachel smiled, though it was a hesitant smile, unsure of how to navigate the space between them now that the truth was out in the open. "No," she said, "it's not just math. What you did today, that was more. You showed all of us something we didn't even know we were missing." James nodded slightly, his gaze turning back to the window. "It's just a glimpse," he said, almost to himself, as if considering the vastness of what he had just accomplished. "There's a lot more." Rachel didn't press further, knowing that James wasn't one for unnecessary praise. Instead, she nodded, quietly acknowledging the weight of what had just transpired. James wasn't just a student. He was a force to be reckoned with, someone whose intellect had been dismissed for far too long. But now the professors and students alike knew that they had a long road ahead of them if they were to fully understand the magnitude of what had just happened. And in the silence that followed, James's reputation began to change. The walls that had once kept him in the shadows started to crumble. What had once been a classroom of underestimation had just become the backdrop for a revolution of intellect. The professors, especially Dr. Langston, now realized they had made a grave mistake, one they could never take back. But in that mistake lay the spark of something far greater, something that would change not just the academic world, but the way people viewed talent and intelligence forever. The professor's disbelief. The next class session felt different. There was an awkwardness in the air, a silence that hung over the room like a thick fog. The usual energy and chatter of students before the lecture had disappeared. Everyone seemed to be on edge, unsure of what to expect after the shock of James's brilliance in the last class. It was as though the entire classroom was holding its breath, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Dr. Langston entered the room as usual, his gait confident and assured, but there was something behind his eyes that betrayed his inner turmoil. He had always prided himself on being a master of his craft, someone who could teach the highest levels of mathematics and instill fear in his students. Yet, the moment James had stepped up to the board and solved that complex equation with ease, his entire worldview had shattered. He had underestimated James, and now there was no going back. As the students filed into their seats, many cast furtive glances at James. Some looked at him with awe, others with confusion. How could a student who seemed so ordinary in every way be capable of such brilliance? It didn't make sense to them. Their minds struggled to reconcile what they had witnessed with the assumptions they had held about James, about his background, his appearance, his perceived place in academia. Dr. Langston cleared his throat and stood at the front of the class, trying to shake off the discomfort. He needed to regain control, to reassert his authority. The last thing he wanted was for his class to get out of hand, for students to start questioning him or the way he ran the course. But he couldn't ignore the feeling in the pit of his stomach, the one that told him this situation was more complicated than he'd originally thought. "All right, let's move on," Dr. Langston said, trying to mask his unease. "We've got more difficult problems to solve today. I hope you're all ready." He cast a quick, almost dismissive glance at James, who was quietly taking his seat. Dr. Langston's attempt to regain control was obvious, but it only served to further highlight his discomfort. One of the professors, Dr. Walker, who had been quietly observing the events from the back of the room, leaned in toward Dr. Langston. "You've got to admit," he whispered, "the kid's got talent. But how did we miss it? How could we have overlooked him like that?" Dr. Langston clenched his jaw. He had never been questioned like this by a colleague, let alone one of his peers. "I don't know," he muttered, his frustration palpable. "But that's not the point right now. We need to keep control of the class." Meanwhile, James sat silently in his seat, his mind already moving past the awkwardness of the moment. He was used to being underestimated, to being seen as less than capable because of the color of his skin. But today, he had shown them. He had proven that their assumptions were nothing more than that, assumptions. Now all he wanted to do was focus on the math. James wasn't interested in seeking validation or approval. He knew his worth. He knew what he was capable of, and no amount of condescending glances or belittling remarks could take that away from him. The fight he had been waging in silence, the quiet battle against the prejudice that plagued every aspect of his life, was now out in the open. But despite his victory, he couldn't help but feel a simmering frustration. How many other brilliant minds had been silenced by the same biases? How many others had been overlooked simply because they didn't fit the image of the ideal student? Dr. Langston, however, had no intention of backing down. He had built his career on his reputation as a brilliant mathematician and a respected professor. He had spent decades in academia, and the thought of being outshone by a student, especially one like James, was intolerable. It wasn't just about the math anymore. It was about his pride, his authority, and his standing within the department. "All right, class," Dr. Langston said, now addressing everyone in a voice that was deliberately stern. "We'll be tackling something much more complex today, a problem that's been challenging even some of the brightest minds in the field. Let's see if anyone can handle it." He wrote a series of equations on the board, equations that looked like a labyrinth of numbers and symbols. The class collectively tensed. They could tell that Dr. Langston was upping the ante. This wasn't just any problem. This was the kind of equation that would separate the students who had what it took from the ones who didn't. He glanced toward James as he wrote the problem on the board, as though daring him to solve it, just as he had dared James earlier. He didn't expect James to even understand it, let alone solve it. The room was still. No one moved. All eyes on the chalkboard. Dr. Langston's eyes narrowed as he waited for someone to take the bait, but to his surprise, it wasn't one of his top students who raised their hand first. It was James. The other students shifted in their seats, some in disbelief, others in shock. Had James just volunteered to solve the problem? The equation was infamous, a challenge that had left many accomplished mathematicians scratching their heads. This was no ordinary test. This was a proving ground, a test that even Ph.D. candidates had struggled with. James, however, didn't flinch. He stood up with quiet confidence, walking to the front of the room, the chalk in his hand feeling weightless. The professors exchanged nervous glances. Dr. Langston, while still trying to maintain his composure, couldn't mask the uneasy smile on his face. "Let's see how he handles this," he thought, silently hoping for a mistake, any mistake, that would allow him to reclaim the upper hand. But James wasn't concerned with the professor's expectations. He was only focused on the equation before him, his mind already working through the solution. The chalk scratched against the board as he carefully wrote down each step, his movements precise and deliberate. The room watched in stunned silence as James worked through the equation effortlessly. His solution flowed with such ease that it seemed almost impossible. The other students who had initially been skeptical were now completely captivated. They watched in awe as James finished, his solution more elegant and comprehensive than anything they had ever seen. Dr. Langston's smile faded. He couldn't understand what he was seeing. The student he had written off as a low-performing individual was now solving equations that he himself would have struggled with. This was more than just a mistake. It was a moment of reckoning. James stepped away from the board, turning to face the class once more. The room remained silent, the weight of his achievement settling in like a heavy fog. It was as though the very air had shifted. The energy of the room, once charged with the arrogance of those in power, now felt heavy with realization. James didn't need to say anything. The room already knew. The professors knew. The students knew. James Carter had just proven them all wrong. The rising tension, the stunned silence in the classroom seemed to stretch on forever. The once boisterous energy of Dr. Langston's classroom, where every student was eager to prove their own brilliance, had now evaporated into a thick, uncomfortable quiet. All eyes were on James. The chalkboard, still covered with his elegant, flawless solution, felt like the weight of 1,000 eyes. Dr. Langston's face, once a mask of smug superiority, was now contorted with disbelief, his composure cracking under the weight of his own mistake. No one had expected this. No one had expected James Carter, the quiet black student from a modest background, to walk to the front of the room, confidently solve the most challenging problem they had encountered all semester, and do so with such grace and precision that even the most seasoned academics in the room were left speechless. It was as though the classroom had collectively held its breath, and now, as they exhaled, they realized just how wrong they had been. James didn't need to say anything to the class. His actions spoke for him. With one simple act of brilliance, he had shattered every preconceived notion about his abilities, his intellect, and his place in this world of elite academia. He had not only proven the professors wrong, he had exposed their own limitations. He had shown them that intelligence was not reserved for a select few, that brilliance could emerge from any place, any background, and it didn't need to be wrapped in the comfortable package of privilege that they were so accustomed to. But as James sat back down, the tension in the room did not dissipate. If anything, it only grew. The professors were now in an unspoken competition to either save face or maintain their intellectual authority. Dr. Langston, flustered, cleared his throat and turned away from the board, as though somehow distancing himself from the very problem he had once been so proud to present. "All right," Dr. Langston muttered, forcing a strained smile as he tried to regain control of the class. "Now that we've seen an interesting solution, let's move on. We've got plenty of material left to cover." The words felt hollow, as though they had been forced out of him. His mind was racing, his confidence shattering with every passing second. How could this have happened? How could James have solved the problem with such ease? He had been certain the problem was too advanced, too complex for someone of James's background, someone who didn't fit the usual mold of a brilliant mathematician. But the question nagged at him. Was it really James's background that had clouded his judgment, or was it his own bias, his own preconceived notion of what a genius should look like, that had caused him to overlook James in the first place? The other professors, who had been silent observers up until now, exchanged uneasy glances. Dr. Walker, who had quietly watched the entire exchange from the back of the room, was the first to speak. "Well," he said slowly, looking at James with a new sense of respect, "that was unexpected. I must admit, James, I didn't think anyone would be able to solve that equation so quickly." The words hung in the air like a reluctant concession. It was the closest thing to an apology that James would receive from any of them, and it was clear that it pained Dr. Walker to offer it. James, as usual, remained composed. He didn't need to defend himself. He didn't need their recognition. What mattered now wasn't their belated acknowledgement. It was the quiet satisfaction that he had proven once and for all that his abilities could not be defined by the box others had tried to place him in. The rest of the class continued in a tense, strained atmosphere. Dr. Langston, visibly shaken, continued to lecture, but his usual authoritative tone lacked its former conviction. He no longer spoke as though he knew everything, as though the students were just waiting to learn from him. Now his words felt hollow, and his authority was no longer absolute. James, on the other hand, found a sense of peace in the chaos that surrounded him. He wasn't here to compete with the professors. He wasn't here to win any approval or make a name for himself. He was simply here to learn. But today, he had taken the opportunity to show that his presence in this room wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mistake. He had earned his place at this table, not because of any external validation, but because of his mind, his intellect, and his sheer determination. By the time the lecture ended, the air was thick with unspoken questions. Dr. Langston had finished his final words and dismissed the class, but no one moved. The students, once eager to leave the room and continue with their day, now seemed hesitant, unsure of how to react. Some of them exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. Others stole a quick look at James, who had gathered his things with the same quiet confidence he always carried. Dr. Langston, once a man of supreme confidence, was left standing at the front of the classroom, his eyes fixed on the door through which James had just walked. He had always prided himself on his ability to teach the most difficult students, to mold the minds of the future. But now, in the wake of James's quiet brilliance, he felt a sense of inadequacy creep in. It wasn't just that James had solved the equation. It was that he had done it without fanfare, without the need for validation. And in doing so, he had exposed the flaw in the very system that had once placed Dr. Langston at its top, a system built on assumptions, biases, and a narrow definition of intelligence. Dr. Langston had never considered that someone like James could possess such genius. He had never seen a student like him, one who didn't need to fit a particular mold to be extraordinary. And now he had to reckon with the reality that his own limitations had blinded him to the true potential of the students around him. Outside the classroom, James walked quietly through the campus, his thoughts drifting as he reflected on the events that had just transpired. The day had been a victory, but it was just one battle in a much larger war. He knew that the professors wouldn't forget what had happened, and he also knew that they wouldn't easily accept the truth that had just been laid before them. But James wasn't concerned with their acceptance. He wasn't concerned with their approval. He was only concerned with the work ahead, the knowledge he was here to gain, and the brilliance he was here to unleash. The rising tension. The days after James's quiet triumph in the classroom were filled with an unsettling tension that permeated the air. Dr. Langston, once the confident authority figure in the room, now found himself questioning everything he thought he knew about the students before him. The math department at the university had long prided itself on fostering the brightest minds, yet James's display of brilliance had exposed a deep flaw in their assumptions about intelligence and who could truly belong in academia. Dr. Langston, alone in his office, reviewed the notes from the previous class, but he couldn't stop thinking about the way James had solved the equation. The problem, once considered too complex for even the best students, had been conquered effortlessly by a student who didn't fit the mold of an academic genius. He had spent years teaching students he believed to be exceptional, yet it was James, a quiet black student, who had defied expectations and proven them all wrong. The realization gnawed at him. How had he missed it? At first, Dr. Langston tried to rationalize the situation. He had assumed James lacked the necessary skills and background. But now, staring at the problem James had solved so effortlessly, Dr. Langston knew it wasn't just a fluke. James wasn't just capable, he was a genius, someone whose brilliance could not be confined by the narrow scope of the professor's preconceived ideas about who should excel in mathematics. As the next class approached, Dr. Langston's nerves tightened. The professors, including Dr. Walker, had all witnessed James's display of intellect, but none knew how to respond. Dr. Walker had quietly acknowledged James's brilliance, but Dr. Langston remained uncomfortable with the idea of a student like James outshining him. The truth was harder to accept than any equation. When the class began, the atmosphere was different. Dr. Langston, struggling to regain his composure, stood at the front of the room, his usual confidence faltering. He cleared his throat, trying to push the unease aside. The students, sensing something was off, fell into an uneasy silence. "We have more advanced problems to solve today," Dr. Langston began, his voice lacking its usual authority. "Let's see who can rise to the challenge this time." The challenge wasn't just about math anymore. It was about regaining control. Dr. Langston turned to the blackboard, scrawling a new, even more complicated equation, one that had left even some of the brightest students struggling in past years. He glanced briefly at James, his eyes cold. Let's see if he's really as good as his solution last class made him appear, he thought. I'll show him that no one is better than the professor. James didn't flinch. He sat quietly, as always, focused on the lesson. He wasn't there to seek validation. He simply wanted to learn, to explore the beauty of mathematics that had always been his passion. He wasn't concerned with Dr. Langston's challenge or the snide glances of his peers. For James, solving the equation had been about proving something to himself, not to anyone else. Dr. Langston's eyes narrowed as he waited for a student to step forward. No one volunteered at first. The problem was far too complex for most students, and no one wanted to risk making a mistake in front of the class. But then, after a few moments of tense silence, James stood up. His movements were calm, deliberate, and when he walked to the front of the class, all eyes followed him. The professors, particularly Dr. Langston, had expected him to falter. He's just a student, Langston thought. He won't be able to handle this one. James approached the board, his hands steady as he picked up the chalk. The problem in front of him, once insurmountable to many of his peers, seemed almost trivial to him. With each movement he worked through the complex steps with ease, his focus unshaken. He wrote out the solution, each stroke of chalk clean and precise, the equations flowing together like a symphony. Dr. Langston stood frozen. He had expected to watch James struggle. He had expected to catch him in a mistake, to watch him flounder in front of the class. But none of that happened. Instead, James solved the equation effortlessly, as though it were just another routine problem. The classroom was silent. Students exchanged glances, unsure of what to say or how to react. Some felt a sense of awe, while others, still trapped in their preconceived notions about intelligence and success, struggled to process what they had just witnessed. James, however, remained calm. He didn't need their praise. He didn't need to explain himself. When he finished, he turned, walking back to his seat with the same quiet composure he had exhibited throughout the entire ordeal. No applause, no recognition, just a simple acknowledgement of his own capability. He wasn't there to seek the approval of others. He was there to do what he had always done, prove to himself that his mind could solve any problem, no matter how difficult. Dr. Langston, stunned, couldn't speak. His authority had been shattered, and the class could feel the shift. The moment was heavy, thick with realization. The professors had underestimated James, and now there was no way to ignore his brilliance. The students, now aware of the genius that had been hiding in plain sight, whispered among themselves. Some were too stunned to speak, others uncertain about how to process what had just happened. One student, Rachel, gathered the courage to approach James as the class began to pack up. "That was incredible," she said softly. "I don't think anyone expected that." James glanced at her briefly, a slight smile on his face. "It's just math," he said simply. Rachel smiled, her respect for him growing. "It's not just math," she replied. "What you did, it was more than that. You've shown us all that we can't judge someone just by how they look or where they come from." James didn't respond. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what she meant. He had proven something to everyone in that room, and it wasn't just about solving complex equations. It was about breaking down the walls of assumption, about showing that brilliance could come from anywhere, from anyone, and that no one should be judged based on their appearance or background. As the students filed out of the room, the tension still hung in the air. The professors, especially Dr. Langston, would have to live with the fact that they had been wrong, that they had let their biases shape their perception of James, and that knowledge would linger with them long after the class had ended. James, however, left the classroom quietly, his mind already shifting to the next problem. He didn't need their acknowledgement. He had already proven what he set out to do. That talent and intelligence could not be confined to any mold. And for James, that was enough. The ripple effect. The days after James's groundbreaking demonstration of his mathematical genius were anything but ordinary. The atmosphere around him shifted in ways he hadn't fully anticipated. What had been a routine class for him, a mere exercise in mathematical exploration, had turned into a defining moment, not just for him, but for everyone involved. The professors, particularly Dr. Langston, found themselves trapped in an uncomfortable silence they couldn't escape. Their initial dismissal of James had been a subtle but powerful reflection of a deeper issue, a bias, a preconceived notion about who belonged in their space, who could be capable of greatness and who couldn't. It was an arrogance they had hidden behind their roles as authority figures in the classroom, confident in their position at the top of the academic hierarchy. But now, in the wake of James's effortless brilliance, the illusion had been shattered. And it wasn't just James who had been changed by this experience. It was everyone. The professors who had once been so certain of their intellectual superiority now found themselves second-guessing their assumptions about intelligence, capability, and potential. Dr. Langston, in particular, was wrestling with his ego, his pride wounded by the reality that he had been so wrong about a student he had written off so easily. He couldn't get over the fact that James, a student he thought of as average, had not only solved an equation that stumped even the brightest minds, but had done so with an ease that made the problem seem elementary. In the days following the incident, the faculty began to discuss James in hushed tones. The professors who had once been dismissive of him were now intrigued, some even fascinated by the idea that they had missed something so fundamental. They spoke of him with a mixture of admiration and regret, realizing how they had allowed their biases to cloud their judgment. Dr. Langston, who had once prided himself on being the ultimate authority, found himself in an internal battle. His pride as a professor had been wounded, and though he tried to maintain his composure in front of his colleagues, the truth was that James had completely upended his worldview. But it wasn't just the professors who were affected. The students in the class were equally shaken. They had been the silent witnesses to a moment that, in many ways, had redefined their understanding of what it meant to be a brilliant student. James had proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that intelligence wasn't limited to those who looked the part, came from the right background, or fit the stereotypical image of a mathematical genius. He had shattered the preconceived notions about who belonged in this space and who didn't. Rachel, the student who had spoken to James after class, found herself particularly moved by the experience. She had been one of the many who had thought of James as just another student, but seeing him solve the equation with such ease had forced her to confront her own assumptions. She had always considered herself intelligent, capable, but after watching James, she couldn't help but feel as if she had been living in a bubble, sheltered by her own biases. In that moment, she realized that brilliance didn't have a uniform, didn't have a set appearance. It wasn't defined by the way someone spoke or the way they dressed. It was a fire that burned inside, something that could not be seen on the surface. As the days passed, James's reputation began to grow. It wasn't just the professors who were beginning to take notice. Other students began to approach him with newfound respect. Those who had once ignored him, assuming he was just another average student, now sought his input on problems, asking for advice, or simply trying to engage him in conversation. But James wasn't interested in their sudden interest. He didn't care about their respect or their newfound admiration. He wasn't here to please anyone. He was here to learn. In the quiet moments when he was alone, James reflected on what had happened. He didn't take pride in the fact that he had outsmarted the professors, but he did feel a sense of validation. This wasn't about showing up anyone. This was about breaking through the walls that had been built around him. the invisible walls that had made people believe he didn't belong in the classroom, didn't belong in a space where the brightest minds gathered. He had done what he set out to do, prove to himself and to them that brilliance was not determined by your background, your skin color, or the expectations others placed on you. But despite his success, James knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead. There would be more people who doubted him, more people who would try to put him in a box, to dismiss him as someone who didn't fit the mold of a true academic. But now, more than ever, James was determined to continue his path. He had already proven that his intelligence couldn't be ignored, that it couldn't be silenced by prejudice or arrogance. But what did that mean for the future? Dr. Langston, though still struggling with his own internal battle, knew something had to change. His authority had been challenged in a way that was impossible to ignore. For years he had assumed that he held all the answers, that his position in academia was secure, untouchable. But now he realized that the world was changing. The ideas that once shaped the academic environment, ideas about who could be a genius, who could be a mathematician, were being questioned, and James had been the catalyst for that change. The professors, once so certain in their superiority, now found themselves questioning their own practices, their own biases. They had been forced to confront a truth that had been hidden beneath the surface for too long. Brilliance was not confined to those who fit the mold. It was something that could emerge from anywhere, from anyone. James, meanwhile, didn't seek validation from the professors or his peers. He wasn't concerned with their approval. What mattered to him now was his journey, the knowledge he was seeking, the problems he was solving, and the doors that were slowly opening for him. But as his reputation spread, James knew that the challenges were far from over. He had only just begun to fight the battles that lay ahead. The days following James's stunning solution to the complex calculus problem left the atmosphere in the university charged. The ripple effects of his brilliance reverberated throughout the academic halls, but they were not met with universal admiration. For James, the breakthrough was more personal than anything. But for others, especially the professors, it had become a matter of their pride, their egos, and their assumptions about who belonged in academia. James had already been accustomed to living under the shadow of others' expectations. His quiet demeanor had always allowed him to slip under the radar. However, now his every move felt as though it was being watched with a renewed sense of scrutiny. While he hadn't sought out this newfound attention, it was clear that his genius could no longer be ignored. Dr. Langston, once the undisputed authority in the room, found himself in an uncomfortable position. For the first time in his career, he had been bested in front of his students. Worse, it wasn't just a simple mistake. James had solved a problem that had left even seasoned mathematicians at a loss. The problem that Dr. Langston had designed to challenge the students had instead exposed his own ignorance. His mind raced as he attempted to come to terms with the harsh reality. James wasn't just good. He was a genius, and that thought haunted him. Yet, despite the mounting pressure, Dr. Langston had no intention of giving in. Instead of confronting his own biases and misjudgments, he chose to double down. He didn't want to admit that he had been wrong about James, and he certainly didn't want to let the rest of the class think that his authority could be questioned. So he did what any proud academic would do in such a situation. He tried to maintain control, to assert his dominance over the classroom once again. But the more he pushed, the more his efforts felt futile. The students, once passive and obedient, now seemed to view him differently. Some even whispered among themselves, exchanging opinions about the display of intellect they had just witnessed. The air in the classroom had changed, and the students felt it. They were no longer passive recipients of knowledge. They had seen the true brilliance of someone who didn't fit the mold of the perfect student. and it had left them questioning everything they thought they knew about intelligence and capability. Rachel, who had been one of the students who initially dismissed James, found herself grappling with conflicting emotions. She had been raised to believe that success in academia was reserved for those who had the right credentials, the right background. But what she had witnessed in that classroom shattered that illusion. James hadn't just solved the problem, he had done so in a way that made the rest of the class, including her, look foolish. She had seen it before, the way students like James were often overlooked or underestimated. She had seen it in her own experience, how some students were given the benefit of the doubt, while others were forced to prove their worth. B. The next few days in class were awkward, to say the least. Dr. Langston, though still attempting to maintain his composure, could no longer command the respect he once had. The students were now more focused on James than on him. His lectures, once filled with the confident air of a professor who knew James, for his part, remained unfazed by the tension around him. He had never cared for validation or recognition. He had always preferred to let his work speak for itself. His resolve was unwavering. This moment wasn't about proving anything to anyone else. It was about showing himself, showing everyone that he belonged in this space. And with each equation he solved, each challenge he overcame, James made it impossible for anyone to dismiss his place in the academic world. As the days passed, rumors began to swirl around campus. Some students whispered about the silent genius in their midst, while others struggled to reconcile the image they had once held of James with the reality they had witnessed. To some, James's brilliance was inspiring. To others, it was a wake-up call. The status quo had been shaken, and no one knew how to handle the aftershocks. But James didn't need their acceptance or understanding. He didn't need anyone to acknowledge what he had done. The math had been solved. The equation had been cracked. He had already proven everything he needed to prove. Not to the professors, not to the other students, but to himself. Yet, as the professors huddled in the STA, as the debate raged on behind closed doors, James continued his work. His journey had only just started, and he was ready to face whatever obstacles came next, because no matter what, his intellect could never be ignored again. The moment of reckoning. The weeks that followed James's revelation in the classroom marked a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who had been part of that fateful day. The fallout from his performance had spread far beyond the classroom, rippling through the entire university. James had become an unexpected icon, his quiet brilliance now a subject of fascination for many. But while the students admired him and some of the faculty begrudgingly acknowledged his talent, Dr. Langston remained a man at war with himself. James had made a point that not only questioned the biases that had been ingrained in the academic world, but also challenged the very foundations of what it meant to be a genius. As the weeks passed, Dr. Langston's pride continued to gnaw at him. He couldn't let the situation stand. The old guard of academia, people like him, who had worked tirelessly to shape their careers and reputations, wasn't supposed to be outshone by someone like James, someone who had been considered an unlikely candidate for greatness. He couldn't bear the thought that James's success had come at the cost of his own self-image. Behind closed doors, Dr. Langston met with his colleagues. The discussions were tense. While some professors, including Dr. Walker, openly praised James, others were far less convinced. Dr. Langston pushed for a deeper investigation into James's academic history, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain how he had outperformed the rest of the class and why he had been able to solve the complex problem so easily. "I just can't believe it," Dr. Langston confessed one afternoon to Dr. Walker. "There has to be something more to this. I mean, The guy doesn't even look like he belongs here. It's unsettling." His voice trembled slightly, betraying the unease he had been trying to suppress. Dr. Walker, more open-minded than Langston, sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Maybe you're missing the point. Perhaps we need to look at ourselves. Have we, as professors, become so blinded by our own perceptions that we've been overlooking genuine talent?" Dr. Langston stiffened. "You're suggesting we've been biased?" Walker shrugged. "I'm suggesting we need to look deeper. Maybe it's time to reconsider how we define excellence. Maybe it doesn't have to come from the places we're used to expecting it from." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, and Langston remained silent for a long while. He wasn't ready to admit that he had been wrong, and yet the nagging doubt gnawed at him, tearing away at his arrogance. Meanwhile, James continued his studies, undeterred by the growing tensions. He wasn't oblivious to the change around him. The whispers among the students had turned into full conversations, and he could feel the eyes of his professors on him more than ever. But he had already made his peace with his place at the university. He knew that his mind was capable of things far beyond what they expected from him, and that gave him a quiet sense of strength. No matter how many times they tried to undermine him, James was here for one reason only: to prove that brilliance could not be contained by their narrow definitions of who was worthy. Rachel, who had been one of the first students to approach James after his performance, had been watching the drama unfold with a mixture of awe and concern. She had always admired James, but now she felt a deep sense of respect for him, knowing that he had done something the others were too afraid to do. He had exposed the truth, and in doing so, he had forced everyone to question their assumptions about race, privilege, and intelligence. One afternoon, after class, Rachel approached James once again, this time with more purpose. "James," she began, hesitating slightly, "you've done something incredible. I don't think anyone truly understands what you've done. But I also know you're dealing with a lot right now, and I want to know how you're handling it." James looked at her, his face calm but thoughtful. "It's nothing personal," he said softly. "I'm not here to change anyone's mind. I'm just here to do my work. What people think of me doesn't matter." Rachel nodded. She had heard the same response from James before. He was always so quiet, so sure of himself, yet so unwilling to engage with the attention that followed his achievements. "But don't you think you should stand up for yourself?" she asked. "You've earned your place here, James. No one can deny that. Don't let them make you feel like you're not welcome." James shook his head. "I don't need to prove anything to them. I'm not here for validation. I'm here to learn. And as long as I'm doing that, nothing else matters." Rachel was quiet for a moment, then asked, "Do you think they'll try to get rid of you?" James raised an eyebrow. "They've tried before," he said with a hint of a smile. "It's nothing new, but I won't go down that easily." Rachel's respect for him grew even further in that moment. She understood now that James's quiet confidence wasn't arrogance, nor was it a facade. It was the strength of someone who had learned to navigate a world that wasn't built for people like him. He had made his mark, and nothing would erase it. As the semester wore on, Dr. Langston's discomfort continued to build. He couldn't escape the truth that James had exposed. The entire department began to take notice, though none of the professors wanted to admit they had been wrong. They were forced to confront the reality that a student like James, one who didn't fit the mold of what they thought a genius should look like, had outsmarted them all. The professors began to question their own biases, but none were brave enough to take responsibility for them. They couldn't reconcile the idea that someone like James, someone they had so easily dismissed, could be the intellectual equal or even superior to them. James, meanwhile, moved forward with quiet determination. He wasn't concerned with the professor's discomfort. He had done what he set out to do, not just solve the problems on the board, but shatter the false narratives surrounding intelligence. In doing so, he had changed the game entirely. The defining moment. As the weeks wore on, the tension between James and his professors became increasingly palpable. What had started as a simple classroom encounter had grown into a larger battle. A battle between the established authority of the faculty and the undeniable brilliance of a student they had once dismissed. James had proven himself in a way no one could ignore, and as the professors and students alike processed the events, something fundamental was changing. Dr. Langston, despite his attempts to bury the discomfort he felt, could not escape the nagging truth. James had humiliated him in front of the class. He had proven that academic excellence didn't belong to the privileged few, but rather to anyone with the capacity and the will to reach for it. And that reality shook Langston's belief system to its core. His authority was no longer absolute. The facade of superiority that had once come so easily now felt fragile, broken. His internal conflict continued to grow. On the one hand, he felt the professional duty to teach the class with the same unyielding confidence as before. On the other, he knew deep down that he had been shown the limits of his own understanding. James wasn't just another student, he was a force that Langston had failed to recognize until it was too late. During the next class, the atmosphere was charged with uncertainty. Dr. Langston, with his attempt at regaining control, put on a brave face, though it was clear he was no longer the towering figure he once believed himself to be. He didn't directly address James's earlier demonstration, but the entire class could feel the palpable shift. Every move he made, every word he spoke was now weighed with hesitation, as if he were waiting for the next unexpected revelation from the student who had already proven him wrong. "I hope you've all had the chance to review the material from last time," Dr. Langston said, though his tone lacked its previous strength. "We'll be continuing with more advanced topics today, but I must say we'll be doing things a bit differently." The class, once full of students eager to absorb knowledge, was now filled with a kind of cautious curiosity. The respect for Dr. Langston had been irrevocably altered, and at the heart of this shift was James, sitting quietly in the back of the room, seemingly untouched by the drama unfolding around him. He was there for one thing and one thing only, the math. No more, no less. Rachel, who had watched James with increasing admiration, noticed the change in the room as well. She had been one of those who had looked at him with skepticism before, not because of who he was, but because of the assumptions she had been taught to hold about students like him. She had learned her lesson the hard way. Now she saw James in an entirely different light. He wasn't just the brilliant student who had solved the equation. He was the catalyst for a much larger change. His quiet defiance had forced everyone in the room to confront their biases, and perhaps even to question the very way they had been taught to see intelligence. That afternoon, after class, Rachel approached James again, unsure of how to phrase what she had been feeling for weeks. She was standing on the precipice of something, unsure of whether she was ready to fully acknowledge what James had accomplished. But today, she decided she couldn't hold back any longer. "James," she began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what happened, and I just wanted to say thank you for showing us all that intelligence doesn't look the way we think it does. You've changed everything for me." James met her gaze for a moment, his expression as calm as ever. "I didn't do it for you," he said, almost as a matter of fact. "I did it for me. For all the times I've been told I didn't belong. That's the real challenge, to stop believing the lies they tell you about who you are and what you're capable of." Rachel paused. His words hit deeper than she expected. For James, this wasn't just about proving something to the professors. It wasn't even about proving something to his classmates. It was a deeper, more personal fight. A fight for self-respect, for validation from within, rather than from an outside world that had constantly tried to dictate who he should be. "I get it," she said, nodding slowly. "But you've done more than just prove something to yourself. You've shown all of us what we were too blind to see. That genius doesn't have a color, a name, or a background. It just is." James nodded, his gaze turning toward the door. "Exactly, but the real question is, what do we do with that truth now?" Rachel thought for a moment, her thoughts moving rapidly. "We change it. We change the way people see talent, see intelligence. We make sure no one is ever overlooked like that again." James didn't respond immediately. He didn't need to. He knew that deep down their fight was just beginning. What he had done, solving that equation, exposing the biases of his professors, was only the start. The true challenge lay ahead, in a world that would continue to judge him based on the surface. But James was ready. He had always known that intelligence wasn't about fitting a mold. It wasn't about what others expected from you. It was about what you were willing to fight for. As the days passed, Dr. Langston continued to try to reassert his authority, but it was clear that the atmosphere in the class had irrevocably changed. His pride was now a shadow of its former self. The other professors who had been complicit in their dismissals of James began to feel the weight of their own ignorance. The conversation around James had shifted from whispers of skepticism to discussions of his future potential. They could no longer ignore him. He had become a symbol of the very thing they had failed to see. Brilliance unbounded by preconceived notions. Rachel, too, found herself grappling with her place in all of this. She had never been as blind to bias as some of her peers, but now the truth felt even more pressing. James had done more than solve an equation. He had cracked open a door that she hadn't even realized was closed. James, in his quiet way, had already moved on from the classroom drama. The equation had been solved, the point had been made, and now it was time to keep pushing forward. For him, it wasn't about the applause, the validation, or the recognition. It was about the work, and the work, for James, had only just begun. The unseen challenge. The weeks after the revelation in class passed in a strange sort of limbo for James. He continued to sit quietly in class, solving problems with ease and speed. But the utmost Dr. Langston, unable to reconcile his bruised ego, began to push back against the growing respect for James. It wasn't overt. He wasn't one to confront someone directly. It wasn't just Dr. Langston, though. The other professors, too, began to feel the weight of their assumptions. In faculty meetings, there were hushed conversations about James. They debated whether they had been wrong to dismiss him and what it meant for their authority as professors. Some of them, like Dr. Walker, started to recognize their own biases and acknowledge James's undeniable talent. But others, particularly Dr. Langston, were unwilling to let go of the belief that James had somehow slipped through the cracks. They didn't want to admit that their prejudices had clouded their judgment. The tension grew. Some students began to avoid James, unsure of how to engage with someone who had broken through every barrier they had taken for granted. Others gravitated toward him, eager to learn from someone who seemed to have mastered not only the subject matter, but the very system they had long relied on. James, however, remained indifferent to the growing pressure around him. He didn't, but as the semester progressed, the real test came. The university's administration had begun to take an interest in James's rapid rise. His academic achievements had drawn attention not just from professors, but from higher-ups who had noticed that his presence was becoming too influential to ignore. They decided it was time to offer him a prestigious research position, an opportunity that could launch his career to unimaginable heights. However, there was a catch. He would have to prove that it was the challenge of a lifetime. James knew that if he accepted, the weight of expectations would fall on him in a way he had never experienced before. This was no longer about proving himself to his professors or classmates. This was about stepping into a world where every move would be scrutinized, every success or failure magnified. The decision wasn't easy. James had spent his life fighting to be seen, to be acknowledged for what he could do. But now, with the door to the future wide open, he was faced with the reality that entering this world would come with its own set of challenges. The question wasn't whether he could rise to the occasion. James knew that he could. The question was whether he was ready to face the responsibility of leading a team and carving out a place for himself in a world that wasn't ready for someone like him. That evening after class, Rachel caught up with James in the hallway. She could tell something. James looked at her, his face calm, but his eyes revealed the inner conflict he was feeling. "They've offered me a research position," he said slowly. "It's an opportunity I can't turn down, but I'm not sure I want to take it." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "Why? This is what you've worked for, right?" "It's not about the opportunity," James replied. "It's about the pressure. It's about the fact that I'll be." Rachel understood. She knew better than anyone the weight that came with being the only one in the room who didn't fit the mold. She had seen it in her own life, how her achievements were often downplayed because she didn't look the part. But she also knew that James was something different. He wasn't just a brilliant mind. He was someone who had earned his place through hard work and determination. "You're not just the exception, James," Rachel said softly. "You're a force. You've earned every single thing you've achieved. Don't let them make you doubt that. If anyone can handle this, it's you." James looked at her for a long moment. The words resonated with him, but he still wasn't sure. The stakes were high. His next move would define not just his future, but how he would be seen for the rest of his career. "I don't know if I'm—" Rachel smiled, her expression understanding. "You don't have to be ready, James. You've already shown everyone who you are. You're ready whether you believe it or not." James took a deep breath, the weight of the decision still heavy on his shoulders, but Rachel's words had struck a chord. He had already proven that he was capable of greatness. Maybe, just maybe, it was time to step up and take what was rightfully his. As he walked away from the conversation, the weight of his decision remained, but something else had changed too. The self-doubt, the hesitation, the fear of failure, all of it had slowly begun to fade. For the first time in his life, James felt as though he wasn't just fighting for the journey was far from over. But now James knew that whatever came next, he was ready to face it. Not just as a student, not just as a mathematician, but as someone who was about to make his mark on a world that had long underestimated him. The unexpected challenge. James's life, after his stunning classroom breakthrough, was a whirlwind of expectation and introspection. Despite the growing acknowledgement of his brilliance, he couldn't escape the pressure. The opportunity presented to him, the prestigious research position, weighed heavily on his mind. He had earned it, without a doubt, but taking that step meant entering a world that was, in many ways, still unwilling to see him for who he truly was. He had always known that the road to success for someone like him would not be a smooth one. James had never been naive enough to believe that once he proved his worth, everything would fall into place. He had lived through enough dismissals, enough subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, forms of prejudice to know that being good enough wasn't enough. He had to be better. He had to be perfect, and he had to prove that his achievements were not just one-off successes, but part of a broader pattern of brilliance. The day he made his decision was gray and cold. James sat alone in his dorm room. the offer letter from the university in front of him. His fingers traced the edges of the paper, hesitating. He had already come so far, and this could be the opportunity of a lifetime. But could he bear the weight of being the token genius? Could he thrive in an environment where his every move might be under a magnifying glass? Rachel's words echoed in his mind. You've already shown everyone who you are. You're ready whether you believe it or not. Her faith in him, her belief that he could rise above whatever the world threw at him, gave him the courage he needed, but the fear of failure still lingered, as it always had. What if he wasn't ready for this level of responsibility? What if he let everyone down? James closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He wasn't just fighting for his own success anymore. He was fighting to reshape the very structure of the academic world around him. He stood up, walked over to his desk, and typed out a reply to the university's offer. He accepted, but this wasn't just about taking a step forward. This was about making a statement that he belonged, that his brilliance could not be overlooked, no matter who he was or where he came from. As the news of his acceptance spread, the reactions from his professors were mixed. Dr. Langston, though still bristling from his earlier defeat, was forced to acknowledge the strength of James's resolve. He could no longer deny the brilliance that had been sitting right in front of him, but there were others who were less willing to accept the change. Some professors saw James as a threat, someone who had exposed the gaps in their understanding and who had the potential to disrupt their carefully constructed world. In the next class, Dr. Langston tried to regain some semblance of control, but his usual swagger was gone. He gave the class another complex problem, this time one that James could easily solve in mere moments. The tension was palpable, the silence deafening. It was as if every move James made was being watched, scrutinized. But James, as always, remained composed. His focus was singular: the math, the work, the challenge. After class, as James was walking out, he felt a tap on his shoulder. It was Dr. Walker, who had been one of the few professors to genuinely recognize James's talent from the start. He smiled warmly, offering James a rare look of respect. "James, I've been meaning to talk to you," Dr. Walker said. "I wanted to congratulate you on the research offer. I think you'll do great things." James nodded but didn't say much. He didn't want to get caught up in the pleasantries or the congratulatory remarks. "Thank you," he replied simply. "You know, I've been thinking," Dr. Walker continued, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You're already on a path that most students here will never even come close to. But remember, it's not just about solving problems. It's about breaking down barriers, challenging assumptions, and proving that anyone from anywhere can be a genius. Just don't let them make you feel like you don't belong. You've earned your place, and I hope you'll continue to push us all to think differently." James was taken aback for a moment, surprised by Dr. Walker's candid words. The older professor, who had once seemed so distant, was now offering him something rare in academia: genuine encouragement. It was clear that Dr. Walker saw something in James that the others hadn't been able to see. "Thank you," James said again, his voice softer now, more appreciative. "I won't forget that." As he left the classroom, James felt something shift within him. It wasn't a sense of validation from the others that he was after, but the realization that he had already won. He had proven that his place in this world wasn't defined by his race, his background, or the expectations of others. He had shown that brilliance could come from anywhere, and for James, that was the most important victory. Later that evening, as James sat in his dorm room, preparing for the next steps in his academic journey, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Rachel. "I saw the announcement. You're going to do amazing things, James. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." James smiled to himself. He was finally starting to believe it. The turning point. The days after James's successful research presentation marked a pivotal moment, not only in his academic career, but also in the way he viewed himself within the system that had long underestimated him. The applause had barely faded when he realized that the battle was far from over. This was just another challenge, another problem to be solved. What had once been an external struggle, the biases of others, had now evolved into a more internal one. James wasn't just proving his genius anymore, he was fighting to hold on to the very thing that had gotten him here, his sense of self-worth. The pressure was building. Every success he achieved seemed to add another layer of expectation. The university had already begun to position him as a symbol of diversity, intelligence, and change. He had been given a platform, one that he had earned through sheer brilliance, but the responsibility that came with it felt suffocating at times. He couldn't shake the feeling that the attention was no longer solely about his intellect. It was about what he represented, a challenge to the establishment, a symbol of change that academia had never asked for. Dr. Langston, still grappling with his own internal conflict, found himself forced to confront something he had never considered, that James's success wasn't a fluke. It wasn't just an exceptional moment in an otherwise ordinary student's career. No, James was the real deal, and the fact that he had spent years dismissing him now filled Langston with guilt. But rather than admit his failure, Dr. Langston doubled down, trying to undermine James's work whenever possible. He had to find a way to maintain control, to somehow reclaim the authority he had lost. Despite the subtle hostility from some of his colleagues, James remained focused on the work, but the weight of his position started to creep into his thoughts. It wasn't enough to just be a brilliant student anymore. He had become a symbol, and symbols were always subject to manipulation. Everyone, it seemed, wanted a piece of him. Some wanted to use him to push an agenda. Others saw him as the exception to the rule, the token genius who had somehow slipped through the cracks. But James knew the truth. None of them saw the real him. They only saw what they wanted to see, what they needed to see in order to maintain their own narratives. It wasn't long before James was faced with another challenge. A prestigious math conference was coming up, and the department had chosen him to present his recent findings. The opportunity was enormous. The audience would be filled with some of the brightest minds in the field. But the more James thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just an academic presentation. It was a test of everything he had fought for. He would be standing in front of a room full of people who didn't believe someone like him, someone from a background like his, could ever truly be one of them. The night before the conference, James found himself alone in his room, reviewing his notes. The pressure was immense. He wasn't just representing himself anymore. He was representing every person who had ever been told they didn't belong. He was carrying the weight of the history of exclusion that had been placed on people like him. For a moment, doubt crept in. What if they didn't listen? What if they still saw him as an outsider, a token, instead of a true intellectual? But then, something shifted inside him. He thought of everything he had overcome, the countless moments of being underestimated, the subtle and overt biases he had faced, and the long hours spent in silence, proving himself to no one but himself. He had already proven that he belonged here. He had already shown that he could rise above the limitations imposed on him by society. Now it was time to show the world. The next morning, James walked into the conference with a quiet confidence. He knew this would be no ordinary presentation. This was his moment to not just showcase his work, but to declare once and for all that he was more than the sum of their expectations. He was not just a brilliant student, he was a force that could not be ignored. As he took the stage, the audience, a mix of esteemed mathematicians and students, fell silent. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to speak. James stood at the podium, taking in the faces in front of him. There were skeptical looks, curious glances, and a few nods of acknowledgement. But James didn't focus on them. He focused on the work, the equations, the research, the truth that had brought him here. With a deep breath, James began. His voice was steady, but there was a calm intensity in it. As he presented his research, breaking down complex theories and solutions with clarity and precision, the audience began to listen more intently. His words were not just academic, they were a declaration of his place in this world, a world that had long been closed to people like him. By the time James concluded his presentation, the room was silent. He stood still for a moment, letting the weight of the moment sink in. Then, slowly, the applause began. It wasn't just polite clapping, it was real, genuine appreciation. They had seen something in James, something they could no longer deny. As he walked off the stage, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. This wasn't just another victory in the classroom. This was a turning point, not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been underestimated, overlooked, or marginalized. But even as the applause echoed in his ears, James knew this was just the beginning. The battle for recognition, for equality, for a world where talent was judged on merit and not appearance or background, that fight would continue. And he would be there, at the forefront, pushing the boundaries of what was possible. The world had finally begun to see him for what he was, not a token, not a symbol, but a force of intellect. And James wasn't going to stop until everyone else saw it too. The triumph. The months that followed James's presentation at the math conference were nothing short of a whirlwind. The academic world, which had once dismissed him, now found itself grappling with the undeniable force of his intellect. James was no longer just a student. He had become a symbol of something much larger. His success wasn't just about his talent. It was about breaking down the barriers that had long excluded people like him from the world of academia. James was aware of the impact he was having, but he was also aware that this newfound attention came with its own set of challenges. He no longer had the luxury of being the quiet student in the back of the classroom. He was now a leader, a trailblazer, and the expectations placed on him were enormous. The very system that had once tried to shut him out was now watching him closely, waiting for him to falter. Despite the pressure, James didn't allow it to affect him. He remained focused on his work. His research had started to gain international recognition, and soon he was invited to collaborate with some of the most renowned mathematicians in the world. He was no longer just a student trying to prove himself. He was a force in the field, one whose name was spoken with respect in academic circles. But it wasn't just his academic achievements that were drawing attention. James had become a symbol of change. His success challenged the very foundations of the academic system, a system that had long operated on the assumption that intelligence had a certain look, a certain background. James had proven that intelligence could come from anywhere, from anyone, and that brilliance didn't conform to the narrow definitions that had been set by those in power. As James's reputation grew, so did the resistance to it. While many praised his achievements, others couldn't stomach the fact that someone who didn't fit the traditional mold of an academic genius had risen to prominence. Dr. Langston, still holding on to his pride, continued to subtly undermine James whenever he could. He couldn't accept the fact that the student who had once been beneath him had now become his intellectual equal. The tension between the two of them continued to build. Every interaction, every meeting, was filled with unspoken animosity. James could feel it, but he refused to let it consume him. He had more important things to focus on. He had worked too hard to let petty biases derail him now. But as the year progressed, something unexpected happened. Dr. Langston, after months of internal conflict, finally acknowledged James's brilliance. It wasn't a grand gesture, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. One day, as James was leaving class, Dr. Langston stopped him at the door. The words that followed were simple, but for James, they carried more weight than any public recognition. "You've earned your place here, James," Dr. Langston said, his voice low but sincere. "I was wrong about you, and I've learned from it." James looked at him surprised. It wasn't an apology, but it was a step in the right direction. "Thank you," he replied quietly, his voice calm but firm. It was a turning point, not just for James, but for Dr. Langston as well. The old professor had finally seen what he had been blind to all along, that intelligence wasn't confined to certain people, certain backgrounds. And in that moment he had to accept that James, who had once been overlooked, was now a leader in his field. With Dr. Langston's acknowledgement, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place for James. He no longer needed validation from anyone. He had proven to the world and to himself that he was more than capable. The fight to prove his worth had come to an end. But the fight to create a more inclusive, more equitable academic environment was only just beginning. James knew that he couldn't change the system alone, but he also knew that his success had started a conversation that would grow and ripple through the academic world, challenging its deeply rooted biases. And he would be there at the forefront, pushing for change every step of the way. The battle had been long and hard, but James had emerged victorious. He had proven that talent, intelligence, and brilliance were not defined by race, background, or the expectations of others. And as he looked forward to the future, he knew that his journey was far from over. James had already made his mark. Now it was time to leave a legacy, one that would change the way the world viewed intelligence forever.